Welcome to Wisdom Wednesday. I'm Dr. Jayne Bock, a Bakerpedia influencer, and I'm here to share some baking wisdom with you today. So today we're going to talk about modern wheat. Typically, this is something I would prefer to discuss in a one-on-one conversation because there are a lot of nuances, there are a lot of landmines in having these types of conversations. And it's really much easier to do this in a one-on-one format where you can go back and forth with questions, you can insert some of that nuance, clarify it, and maybe help make sense of it a little bit easier. But today I'm going to do a little bit of this in a video. And what we're discussing is modern wheat and whether it is different somehow from heritage or ancient wheats. So one of the popular, and I am going to call it a myth because scientifically we have the evidence to indicate that yes, it is a myth, that modern wheat is somehow nutritionally inferior to heritage or older varieties of wheat that predate the Green Revolution. So the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this is determined by perhaps moral or sometimes almost religious beliefs about different foods and whether they are good or bad, natural or unnatural, healthy or unhealthy. And these designations are given without a lot of thought to whether they are appropriate or even backed up by any kind of scientific evidence. And this is a bit of a touchy subject. A lot of the conversation around modern wheat kind of feeds into the clean eating sphere, which of course is also a very difficult topic to have a conversation about because there is actually an eating disorder associated with clean eating. It's called Orthorexia and Nervosa. And it's when clean eating is taken to such an extreme that the number of different food items that an individual allows themselves to eat based on their specific designations of clean or healthy is so limited that it limits calories and it consumes their every waking thought. So there is a psychological component to it. There's an eating disorder component to it at times when it's taken to the extreme. And so I just want to be cognizant about that with this conversation. So let's start to really get into modern wheat. And I think the concern really came to the fore with the publication of Wheat Belly, where the author asserted that modern wheat is light years removed from the heritage varieties of wheat that we quote unquote grew up with throughout the process of human evolution. And that we have so thoroughly genetically modified, that is not perhaps the appropriate term to use, but that is the term the author uses, that modern wheat has been so genetically modified that it has very little resemblance to heritage wheat varieties. And I'm perhaps not characterizing the nuance of that argument, but the spirit of it is there. So it's been around in the popular zeitgeist for a while, and a lot of people have kind of latched on to that idea because on the surface it sounds really plausible that the Green Revolution perhaps led to this radical change in modern wheat, and perhaps that's why we're seeing some of these health issues. That's why we're seeing increased prevalence of celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, and other issues in the general population. So Dr. Julie Miller-Jones actually wrote a very eloquent article refuting most of the nutritional claims that the Wheat Belly author put forward in his book. And she did specifically address modern wheat breeding and genetics. And I would highly encourage you, if you have a library, with access to Cereal Foods World, that you look up her article and you read it thoughtfully, because really she said it best. She is a highly regarded nutritionist, one of the leading experts internationally, especially in wheat and grain-based nutrition. And so if you're going to talk to an expert on this subject, Julie Miller-Jones would certainly be the person that you would want to be talking to. So one of the things that the Wheat Belly author asserts is that, wheat is the product of genetic research, and we are eating very genetically altered wheat. So to understand wheat breeding and its context within modern wheat, the first thing I have to point out is that there is no, especially in North America, there is no commercially available genetically modified wheat using genetic modification technologies. So the fear around GMO wheat, it is not commercially available in North America and most parts of the world. There is a GMO wheat down in South America now, but it has very limited distribution. But there is no large-scale genetically modified wheat on the market. So humans have been modifying wheat and other plants, all plant-based foods. We have been modifying them throughout the course of human evolution ever since we first started cultivating them for our own purposes. And one of the first things we did inadvertently was we selected for non-shattering seeds. If the seed shatters, it falls to the ground and therefore you cannot harvest it. So the only seeds that are left for harvest are those that are non-shattering. And therefore, if you plant them, you are going to create more progeny that are less susceptible to shattering. And so through these inadvertent selections, yes, we have technically genetically modified wheat throughout the course of human existence and through the course of consumption of this grain. And a lot of that was done without a lot of direct manipulation. We just selected for things without really knowing it. And we started to modify wheat. It wasn't until the 20th century that we really began to understand plant genetics and maybe try to cross different varieties to get certain desirable traits, especially disease resistance, better yield, better agronomic management, so being able to grow it with fewer inputs, more drought tolerance, things like that. And at times also for nutritional benefit as well. What happened with the green evolution was that we started to move towards semi-dwarf varieties of wheat. So what that means is that the wheat stalk itself is much shorter. With taller wheat stalks, there is a risk for something known as lodging. So the wheat plant gets knocked over due to high winds or a storm or something of that nature, and therefore it is no longer harvestable. So by breeding for dwarf varieties of wheat, you shorten the stalk, it's less prone to lodging or it's less prone to falling over, and you are able to harvest more per acre because you haven't lost that to the stalk falling over. And so when you're talking about a growing population and needing to get more food per acre of farmland, because of course farmland is not expanding, that was certainly a big step forward. Of course, there was also an increased emphasis on yield as well in combination with these semi-dwarf varieties. Because again, you need to get more food per acre. We are trying to feed more and more people with less and less land. And so there is this thought that by moving towards semi-dwarf varieties and by emphasizing yield, that we maybe have made wheat perhaps less nutritiously sound. And so I've gone through the literature. There have been a whole bunch of studies that have been done, and I found one really nice review that asks the very specific question, do modern types of wheat have lower quality nutrition for human health? And what they did after reviewing dozens and dozens of well-designed peer-reviewed studies that passed muster, what they found is that really there has been no change in the nutritional quality of wheat over looking at varieties from the 1800s all the way through the most current modern wheat releases. They did find that perhaps there was a decrease in the amount of iron, zinc, and selenium, but that was counterbalanced by increases in calcium and potassium, so it's a bit of a wash. And certainly if iron and zinc are nutrients of concern, then there are agronomic management strategies that can be employed to increase the quantity of those minerals in the grain itself. But in terms of the overall nutritional composition of heritage varieties of wheat and modern varieties of wheat, the nutritional comparison is very similar. There are no differences nutritionally. In fact, they did find that within the endosperm, or the white flour fraction, if you take the bran out, there was perhaps more soluble fiber available than in heritage varieties. So in some cases, there was maybe a slight nutritional boost to modern wheat, but at the end of the day, really, there's no nutritional difference between modern wheats and heritage wheats. And that's when you've done a direct head-to-head comparison. The other question that frequently comes up is the increase in the incidence of celiac disease among the general population. And there has been some thought that wheat breeding and selecting for certain proteins that are technologically functional in the bakery, better mixing properties, better dough handling, better rise, better volume, that perhaps selecting for some of these proteins has inadvertently increased the amount of celiac reactive epitopes in modern varieties of wheat. Again, there have been numerous studies now conducted on this subject, asking the direct question, are modern wheats more prone to contain greater amounts of celiac reactive epitopes, proteins, I should say, celiac reactive proteins, than heritage varieties? There have been a large number of labs that have worked in this area. One of the most active would be the group headed by Katharina Scherf in Germany. She's perhaps one of the most brilliant cereal chemists of my generation. And she did a direct comparison of old versus modern wheat varieties, looking at whether or not there's a greater tendency for modern wheats to elicit celiac disease to a higher degree. And what they found was, and I'll quote from the abstract here, the immunoreactive potential of old and modern wheat cultivars appears to be similar. So what that means is that modern wheats do not have higher levels of proteins that are problematic for celiac patients. So from a nutritional standpoint, looking at the actual proteins that elicit celiac disease, there's no difference between heritage and modern varieties. In fact, in some heritage varieties, the amount of celiac reactive proteins was much greater than in modern wheat. So again, it does not appear that modern wheat has been manipulated in such a way that the risk of celiac disease would be greater. So obviously there's something else going on that is behind the increase in the incidence of celiac disease, but it is not modern wheat itself. So these are just a few talking points around modern wheat, just to get the conversation started. There's a whole lot more to unpack in terms of some of the claims around modern wheat and nutrition. You know, a lot of times these groups will come out and they'll say, oh, you know, you can only eat whole wheat, or you should only eat whole wheat because it's far superior nutritionally. And indeed, there is absolutely a benefit to consuming whole grains. There is a reason within the US that we ask, or that the dietary guidelines suggest that half of your grains be whole grains. The thing to keep in mind with whole grains, however, is that not all of that nutrition is bioavailable. So if you want to talk about iron, if you want to talk about some of the vitamins and micronutrients. They are very tightly bound up in the bran fraction, and they are not necessarily bioavailable on consumption. So the reason why dietary guidelines suggest that half of your grains be whole grains, because by consuming breads, crackers, tortillas, pastas that have been made with enriched flours, so flours where B vitamins, iron, and folate have been added to the flour, these are nutrients of concern within the general population, and most of us are not getting enough of those, even when eating the cleanest, healthiest whole food diet. And so by consuming enriched flour, you automatically boost the intake of these nutrients of concern because they are more bioavailable. The bran is not continuing to bind them. The other thing to keep in mind with whole wheat flour is that you have the bran and the germ there. They have wonderful nutritional properties, but from a storage standpoint, they are more difficult to store because fat starts to oxidize. It starts to go rancid. And so the shelf life on whole wheat flour is very, very short. And there's this misguided notion that stone ground whole wheat flour is somehow superior to roller milled whole wheat flour. I'm struggling to wrap my head around this, and it's probably because I'm too close to it. So both roller milled whole grain flour and stone milled whole grain flour have all the same components present in the same percentages. The only thing that's happening in stone ground flour is that the entire wheat kernel is being ground at once and there's no separation. With roller mills, by definition, all the different fractions are separated, but then they're recombined again without any manipulation. So all the components that were there are being put back together. That separation just allows for a little bit finer grinding. So the claim somehow that non-stone milled whole wheat flour is somehow nutritionally superior to roller milled whole wheat flour is very misguided. They are nutritionally comparable. They have all the same components there and all the same ratios. So really there's no fear in eating your basic average whole wheat flour that's come from a roller mill, perhaps. It doesn't need to be stone ground. The other thing is that people will claim that white flour pests won't even eat these white flours. I can assure you that's very untrue. Anyone who handles flour, white flour or whole wheat flour can tell you that pests, rodents, bugs will find those flours and they will infest them readily, regardless of whether the bran and the germ are there or not. So there's a whole host of things that we really probably should talk about. I'm running out of time with this Wisdom Wednesday, so hopefully this opens the conversation. You can start to maybe ask some questions, and maybe we can do a deep dive into specific aspects of modern versus heritage wheat and the nutrition around that, the nutrition around whole wheat versus white enriched flour and the products coming from them. There's a lot of great scientific evidence that I would be very happy to cite and share with you and help you understand scientifically that a lot of these myths out there are just that. They are myths. There is no hard evidence behind any of them. And we have the scientific evidence that we can share with you to make you less concerned, to allay your concerns, to address your concerns. Nobody should ever be afraid of their food. And I hate it when I see fear mongering like this that makes people afraid to eat healthy, wholesome, nutritious foods. So we'll start to wrap this up here. That's it for Wisdom Wednesday today. Don't forget to ask questions, join us in the forums at LinkedIn and Facebook. Just look up the baking industry professionals groups on these platforms. And yeah, let us know your questions. Till next time, I'll go ahead and let you go.